So, I had an existential crisis the other day, because I have issues. Somebody said we know. All right. That's true. But I figured out I can't do math anymore, right? And it sounds funny, but I'm sitting down at the counter. I needed to plug my phone in and charge it, so it's charging the other room, and I needed to balance the checkbook. So I'm about 3 entries deep into the checkbook, and I realize I don't have a calculator. And I'm looking at this, and there's numbers, and they got to go down, and there's decimals in it. So I had to ask myself, do I do real math, or do I go get my phone and get the calculator? But then I had to sit there and say, well, but if I have to go get my phone, that means I got to get up and actually expend some energy. So then I had to wrestle with myself, is math worth the energy? And if you look at me, you can see which one won, right? But actually this time I beat it. I actually got up and decided this math was too hard for me. So I got the phone, and not only did I get the phone, I had to unplug the charger, plug it back into the kitchen. It was a whole ordeal, right? But I realized that something was taken from me, right? My ability to think how I used to think and do math before I had something in my pocket that could do it all for me. I lost it. And I kept thinking about it because it bothered me. I laughed and I said, this is the new world we are living in, and we're going to talk about this in the coming months and all of this. But I thought, I lost the ability to do some simple math because I got a little spooked because decimals and it's serious, all of these things. And I kept thinking about this verse, and I'm not going to read the passage, but in the Gospel of John in chapter 10, it talks about listening for the voice of the shepherd and how we are sheep. And I kept thinking about this idea of math and how I lost it, and how we are also losing the ability to listen for the voice of God in our world, to listen for the voice of God in my own life, because I am so distracted and I am slowly giving more and more of my thought process away to a machine to do my thinking for me, that sometimes I feel like I'm not going to hear God unless I search for God online, right? Or something like that. We lose it. So I want to focus this morning on that passage in the 10th chapter, but also on the art of listening, which is something very hard for me to do, very hard for us to do, especially in this new world we live in when we are so distracted. But we are to listen, to be silent, to provide space to hear, even if it is a minute, even if it is 2 minutes here as we are silent in this sanctuary, to pay attention and hear the voice of the one calling us. It's hard. It's hard like math, but it's something we need to reclaim. But one of the questions I often get asked is, okay, you're a pastor, you're supposed to understand things about God and all these. How can I know God's voice? How can I hear it? And people figure out all of that, and they search their entire life for that. And again, with what is going on in this world, we lose sight because of all of the distractions that we have. But a big part of knowing God's voice is paying attention and listening. Quieting our mouth, not talking, but listening. Just being silent, which makes us uncomfortable, or at least some of us, because we focus and we lose our thought or whatever it is, or we pay attention to all the other noises around us. But it starts there. How do I know God's voice? Well, first you need to listen for it. You need to hear it and learn it. But again, you keep saying about distractions. One of the distractions I had recently is I've had a bad cycle of not sleeping, which I battle with. So about 2:30 in the morning the other night, like any other good insomniac, I was going down the rabbit hole of the internet and reading random things, and I came across this book called The Hyperlinked Life. Right? And we're going to talk about this in Living Stones in the fall. We're going to have an unplugged weekend where we come here to the church and unplug everything and just focus on relationships and be here. But this hyperlinked life tells us that not only are we changing, we are losing the ability to connect ourselves to the spiritual and to God, because it takes work and it's hard, and I'd rather go up and get my phone to do it for me instead of working it out in my own head. And I'm simplifying that book, but it's a problem that we are creating that has not really been fished out yet, especially the theological problem of what we are losing. And I know I'm not really making sense, but hopefully it will pull all together. But we're so distracted, and I found this list. I might have shared this with you before, but we spend a lot of time on things that are really nonsense. It says in a lifetime, the average American will spend 6 months at a stoplight, right? It says that we will spend 8 months opening junk mail. Now, I don't know if that's still true, because now I just throw my mail away, because everything comes electronically, so I know I don't need to read anything in my mailbox. At least I hope. 1 year, it says 1 year. Now this I think is getting bigger for me, but 1 year we will spend in our lifetime looking for lost things. Just looking for things. And often it's on top of my head or something. 2 years unsuccessfully returning phone calls or listening to voicemails. 4 years doing housework. 5 years waiting in line. 6 years eating, or all the time. All of this, the average prayer is 5 minutes long. The average prayer is 5 minutes long, 3 times a week, one of those times being here on Sunday morning with what we just did. So that means most people only spend about 2 other days a week trying to pray and lasts about 5 minutes. And within those 5 minutes, instead of being quiet and listening for God, within those 5 minutes, statistically it says 82% ask for health of somebody, 75% ask for strength, some ask for financial success, for God to answer prayers, for yelling at God because God does not answer prayers, yelling at God and figuring out if God plays favorites and is like somebody better than me. 79% said that their prayer is about finding jobs. 54% said that their prayers means that if they didn't have an answer to prayer, that maybe God just isn't listening. So, but all of those things, right? Or we ask for things. But the most important thing I think we have lost is the very basic idea of before we can do anything in prayer, we need to ask God, help me to listen. Shut my mouth and help me to know your voice. So this passage in the 10th chapter of John talks about sheep. Right? And it kind of is a metaphor to say that we are like sheep, which isn't really a compliment, right? Sheep are stubborn and sheep are not that smart. I mean, have you ever went somewhere and saw a trained sheep? Right? Like you go to the circus, you go to all these places and there's elephants and there's horses and there's dogs, cats, and nobody comes out and says, oh, here's my sheep, let's watch them do tricks. They don't, because they're stubborn and they do what they want and they don't listen very well. Right? All of these things. So, sheep are that great metaphor for that, and they wander away from the voice of the shepherd. Sometimes they have to listen to see who is calling them. I mean, have any of you ever been stubborn and not listened? They are afraid they get spooked, so much so that they can find themselves near a cliff, get spooked because they're dumb, and fall over the cliff and make their situation 100 times worse. So, have you ever faltered and stumbled around because the chaos around you because you haven't listened? Can we learn here? Feel the voice of God when we don't listen. Will we know it, or will we be distracted like these sheep, like these stubborn things? But one thing that the sheep does have going for them is that they pay attention and they can tell who their shepherd is. And a lot of times they can be herded either with the dogs or the voices of the shepherd because they listen for that voice. Now, I don't know if this is true or just something online, because we can believe everything we read online. But there was this story that said in this rural place, 2 people were fighting about a lost sheep. 2 shepherds were saying that sheep was theirs. It wasn't marked. So the judge said, well, we'll settle this, we'll go outside. So they go outside and they bring the sheep in, and the judge says, I want both of you to call the sheep. And of course the sheep went to the correct shepherd, right? Because it listened and it knew the voice of God. Or not God, of that shepherd. But we are like that. Can I pick out God's voice amid all of the other voices I am hearing and I'm being drowned with? Can I pick out the one voice that will bring life to me? But it starts with us being quiet, and it's hard, and it takes work, and sometimes I don't want to do it, but we need to be quiet and focus. Sometimes when I need to be quiet, I take my dog Vinny and I go for a walk. And some of you have said that you've seen me walking around and you wave, and I don't even know you passed me. Right? Because I have issues and I retreat into myself sometimes, I'm just focused on my own head and trying to go with my thoughts and being quiet. But even when I'm alone trying to be quiet and listen to God, other people will tell me, John, one day somebody's going to call the cops because you walk down the street and my lips move, which means I talk to myself, right? And before I know it, I'm in a full-blown conversation, and I'm Italian, so I'm walking my dog and my hands are moving and I'm talking. Luckily, I have headphones on so I can say, well, I'm just singing, but I'm not. I'm really like wrestling with things, right? But even alone, I get distracted and I don't listen, and I forget what that voice of God sounds like. We need to reconnect to that. I need to learn that. If I want anything to go in my life, if I want to heal my spiritual life, be successful, whatever you want, it starts with me shutting up and listening and just being in that presence. And even though it is hard, that is what I long for. That is my goal of my entire Christian life, is just to be connected to God and hear that voice speak to us. I feel like a cranky old man, and by that I mean, like when I was a kid, there was always those old men that were cranky and be like, well, back in my day, we didn't do this. Back in my day, we did this. And I was at the Elks the other night, and I was with some buddies, and I found myself doing that. Because we were talking about the phones. We were talking about all these distractions. I'm like, man, when I was a kid, we were outside. When I was a kid, and then I felt like Bill Cosby, you know, not the bad Bill Cosby, the the good Bill Cosby, you know, when he was doing the comedy, and he's like, I had to walk uphill barefoot, and we didn't have a bucket for the milk, so I had to have my hands, and it was it was tough, it was different. And then even felt older because one of the people there didn't even know what we were talking about. Right? Because they were in their 20s. I lost my train of thought. But I feel like that cranky old man because I'm having a wrestling match. And I love this. I'm not getting rid of it. What I mean by, though, is it's taking over even our spiritual lives. It's taking over how we think about things, how we do things, how we listen to God, and it drowns out almost all of that. And it drains us. So somehow we have to reconnect. I need to learn how to do math again. I need to learn how to pray again. I need to learn how to listen and hear God's voice again, because that is what we are called for. And it is hard. There's this great story that I heard that said this grandfather and his grandson, it was an ice storm, and they were out building this ice castle in the backyard having a great time. And they go back in for some hot chocolate, and the grandfather realized he lost his watch while they were doing this. And the kid says, well, Grandpa, let's go out and look for the watch. And they look and they can't find it. And like within 2 minutes, the kid is like, let's give up. It's lost forever. We're not going to hear it. It's too windy. And the grandfather's like, no, my watch is mechanical, kind of like this one that you have to wind up. And it makes a tick, 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 just a small little tick that you can't hear right now. But if it was silent and you focus, you can hear it. So the kid wants to give up, and the grandfather says, we're not giving up. You're going to learn to listen and find it. And she's like, how am I going to do that? Look at everything that around us making the noise. And the grandfather says, well, first, shut up, right? Okay? And I know that's tough, but sometimes we need that, right? So be quiet. I want you to put your ear to the ground. And I want you to put everything else out, and I want you to listen. And the kid does it, and the kid's like, I hear a lot of things. And the grandfather says, focus and listen. And he sat there, I don't know how long. But then all of a sudden the kid heard tick, tick, tick. He's like, oh, I found it. And he dug the watch right out of the snow. We are like that kid. We have lost the voice of God. And God is calling for us to shut up, okay, quiet ourselves, be less distracted, and listen for the ticking of God's heart. Listen for that voice that calls us out of the wilderness and out of the chaos. To listen for that little whisper that can breathe so much life into us that we continue to do our jobs and continue to make a difference in this life. But it starts with us listening for that voice. We need to claim some things, take them back. In our faith, our spirituality, our ability to sit still and listen. And yes, I'm only 41 and I'm cranky about it, okay? When I started out 21 years ago, we were taught, and I'm going on a side thing, but we were taught in graduate school and seminary that 20 minutes is probably the longest you want to preach for. Now, I grew up in a church that the minister preached like an hour. I don't know what he said, but he talked for an hour, right? And after about 15, 20 minutes, even back then, people were like, are you still talking? Right? Because we can't focus. But they've just done something recently that says now it's not 20 minutes, it's something like 14 or 12 minutes that we have an attention span for. So in other words, God can come down here and preach, but he's only getting 12 minutes of our time, right? But what do we do with that? What do we do? Do we listen enough? Do we pay attention so that when God does speak, we can hear it? Or do I give up because it's hard and there's too many other things and I don't feel like listening for a little ticking? But that is what we are called to do. And then something happens in our lives when we listen, when we pause, when we breathe. We hear the ticking of God's heart and it builds us up. Easy? Sounds like it, but it's not. It's probably one of the hardest things we're going to do. But we have to do it. Put our ear down and listen. Because I'll tell you, as much as the things that I don't know, and I was talking to Todd about how in the last 6 months I figured out I know absolutely nothing in the last 21 years of studying God. God's actually revealed more to me once I realized I don't know what I'm talking about than when I did. But it starts with realizing, well, why don't you listen first instead of thinking you have it all figured out? Like you get in those conversations with people, like my brother's one of them. I'll be talking to him. I could talk and he doesn't listen to anything. Then 2 minutes later, and I do this too, 2 minutes later, he asks me the same question I just answered, right? And we all do that because I'm not really paying attention. I want to be heard. But instead, I'm not listening to what other people are saying and we miss things. I want God to hear me. I'm not so much interested in hearing God. That's what we need to change and flip around. It is tough, but that's what we are called to do. To listen for this voice, because it is a voice and it is vital for our survival. So let us pray. Lord, as we continue these journeys, as we battle changing times and the way we do things and the way we think, help us to remember that we are part of something ancient, and it means that we are to listen to it, that we are to hear it. That like the sheep that know the voice of the shepherd, we need to know your voice amidst all of the other ones that are clamoring for our attention. So quiet us, discipline us, teach us, so that we can hear your voice and continue to walk in your direction. And all of God's people said, Amen. If you'll please stand as they close us in worship.